Hi, everyone. Thank you. It's been a great day. Appreciate you all being here. And I guess as Tom and I are holding everybody up from drinks, so therefore it's always a difficult spot to be in. Tom, I guess let's start with the idea. Of course, we're here at the CFA Society at the 10th annual Ben Graham Day. So therefore, Ben Graham and Ben Graham's investment philosophy, how's that personified in Markel? And how did those two things come together?
Well, again, thank you for having me, and thank you for holding in there before drinks. When I think about Ben Graham, both in terms of Markel and just intellectually, let me start with his intellectual prowess. And as I've been here through the afternoon and hearing some of the different people speak, it reminds me of the intellectualism that exists in the pursuit of investment thought. And the previous panel was talking about complexity. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that Ben Graham really should be more known for than he was is the breadth of his intellect. Right. So, he was offered professorships in the classics and mathematics, as well as creating the discipline of finance, largely. Right. So I think that the breadth and depth of what Ben Graham covered is something that we should all be mindful of in a couple of ways. One, we should always sort of be trying to develop skills beyond the oftentimes narrow slot that we have to carve out a place for ourselves as investment professionals. And also, we should be very respectful and curious about ideas that come from people who operate in different disciplines. So we may not be expert in them, but we should be aware of them and curious and thoughtful. And certainly the worst possible thing you could be is dismissive, right, which I observe happening lots of times about a lot of things. So that's the first thing I want to say about Ben Graham. Secondly, again, in the previous panel, there was the idea of complexity. So we're all trying to find ways and methods and this approach and that approach and guidelines and rules of thumb and all that sort of stuff. And those are all great, but they're not the totality of what we should do. So oftentimes when you think about as the way things are practiced and the way Ben Graham sort of made a bunch of money, in addition to being a great academic through the 30s and 40s and 50s when he practices. Also, he himself would have said, if it wasn't for Geico, you wouldn't know my name. Mm-hmm. So in something that really did not fit the tests and followed the guidelines in many ways, traditionally, of what it was he laid out as a course of study and a way to do things, by sort of violating that law or thinking more expansively about it, he ended up making what was the greatest investment of his life. And I wasn't in the room, but I have heard the story that he was so sort of bothered by the cognitive dissonance of what it meant to buy a big slug of Geico that he left the room and had his partner, Jerry Newman, put in the trade. Because he knew that was not his normal way of doing things and felt like he needed to be out of the room when that happened. Right. I don't know if it happened or not, but it's a great story.
So one of the recurring topics that we've heard today is Lee early on talked about converting from an asset management business into a family office, and therefore the time perspective horizon is different, and how that has huge impacts on investing. Then, of course, in the panel before, we talked about how GD's credit funds are creating things that really create mechanisms where you have permanent capital, and therefore emulating some of what Berkshire did. So therefore, all of us probably are really jealous here because, Tom, you do run a vehicle that does have permanent capital, that the claim on it is when those insurance reserves occur. How does that work? What does that do about how you invest, how you think about investing?
Well, I think that's a great point. And I think I was lucky enough to stumble into it more than design it. So for instance, in our home, my wife is a chemical engineer by training. And I am so grateful because it's good to have someone in your life who does do things precisely and is able to plan ahead and think about things and measure. So, for instance, if something gets baked in our home, Susan does it. I would be a mess of a baker because baking requires precision. And if things get cooked in our home, maybe half the time I do cook things, but I have one kitchen appliance, one. And I believe you only need one kitchen appliance, and that is a cast iron skillet. And I can assure you, nothing gets measured. It's just sort of thrown in there. And the fact of the matter is, believe it or not, she does like what I cook. and I love what she bakes. So both disciplines are valid, and both things are good ways of doing things. So I think I came into the notion of some things that Lee would have been talking about through the process of just chucking stuff in a skillet and seeing what tasted good, and having certain principles that work. There's a cookbook, I think, called Heat, Fat, Acid, and Salt. And, when you have those sort of four things going on, it's going to be okay. So Markel, to some degree, and again, sometimes if you're not familiar with Markel, or trying to explain it to somebody who might not know it, one of the ways I describe it is I say, in effect, I think we're a publicly traded family office. And I think there are some unique structural advantages, like the structural advantages that were alluded to in the last panel, that really are quite helpful when that is the construct. And specifically, and this goes to like the buildup of our Markel Ventures operations, which are our non-insurance businesses that have been put together over the last 18 years or so. If you look at the typical company that we would buy that becomes part of Markel Ventures, oftentimes there is a founding family involved. And it's usually not the first generation, it's the second or third, or sometimes even the fourth generation by the time we get around. And in a business such as that, the capital needs and structure of the business itself and the capital needs and structure of the founder and the founder's family and the principals are intertwined. And there's no way that a decision can be made that does not have ripple and feedback effects from one upon the other. So usually there comes a period of time when the family has kind of played out its string, and the fourth or fifth generation is, they're off doing other things. They're just not interested in the business itself. So that business independently on its own faces a very tough inflection point. What are you going to do? So the founder, how do you extract some capital that is appropriate for your lifestyle and things you want to do, and not have that redound to what happens to the business itself? So by virtue of the fact that we have permanent capital, we are in a unique position to separate the interests of the business and separate the interest of the founder and the founder family, and as such, make rational decisions about the business that are satisfactory to the founding family. And then by virtue of the fact that we're publicly traded, people can get in or out of the surviving vehicle of Markel at their convenience. And for instance, myself, there were three generations of the Markel family that ran the business before I showed up. And I showed up in 1990. And frankly, even before I came in the door, I had purchased some Markel stock. So I like to strut around and say, I was adopted member of the Markel family, which I was able to do as we feel any public shareholder of Markel can be. And if there's a wedding, a college tuition, whatever, and you want to liquidate a partial interest, a partial stake of what you have in the business, you can do that by virtue of the fact that it's publicly traded. So there are a lot of structural advantages that we stumbled upon or found out or cast iron skilleted our way to, rather than precisely figuring out what the baking was going to be.
A critical part, I think, of the company is also culture, and that ties in specifically with Markel Ventures and a lot of different aspects. And somehow that's an asset that isn't on the balance sheet, but that potentially, and especially in a competitive world of buying businesses, could be a critical differentiator. How does that manifest itself?
I think that's a spectacular cultural advantage, and it's very important, and it's really all we have. So you think of the song, "The Little Drummer Boy," pa-rum-pa-bum-pum. That was it. Doesn't seem like very much, but yet it's an enduring song. And to some degree, our cultural advantage is the pa-rum-pa-bum-pum of the little drummer boy. So if, again, think about the nature of our insurance business that has been through three generations of family leadership before. Again, and I started at age 28, been there 32 years. So, I feel like a family member, even though I'm not. And I feel a sense of long-term stewardship and obligation and sensation to hand the baton off to the next generation better off than the way I found it. And that just infuses your decision making, number one. Number two, it marries up well with these people who have nursed and nurtured and built businesses that they are defined by. It's their identity for so long. And they respect and find kindred spirits in the sense of the way things are done at Markel and some of the tangible ways that shows up. So of the 19 or 20 businesses that we've bought in Markel Ventures starting in 2005, probably 16 of the CEOs who ran those businesses when we bought them are still running those businesses. There's been a couple normal retirements and a couple where, frankly, our worldviews ended up being differently, and I made a mistake. But that's a pretty good batting average, and I think that is reflective of the culture. And then the last piece of that is, Jerry Maguire would say, show me the money, or Jerry's client. The fact of the matter, Markel Ventures was an idea in 2005, and now it's a business with $5 billion of top line revenues and $500 million of EBITDA. So it's making pretty good money too, and produce very good returns on capital. So any way you want to check it, qualitatively, by the narrative or by the numbers, it checks out. And again, when I'm here and I'm in New York 1 or 2 days a week, and I'm in settings like this or meetings like this, and I see what the big league pros are doing, as opposed to the flying squirrels of Richmond, Virginia, and that is the actual name of our baseball team. How can we compete? How can we compete? We can't win IQ contests. We can't win things where you need the big league top shelf talent and skills and presence and systems that exist in New York. So how do we compete? Through patience, through time horizon, through culture, through building relationships that endure. And every deal that we do, every transaction that we're involved in, we want the other side to win. If we do business with the customer, we want the customer to win. We have an associate that is part of the firm. We want them to feel like they're winning, that they're creative, that they are learning, that they're taking care of their families, they're supporting their community, that they have a real sensation of good things happening. Now, if those two things work, then we believe that the returns on capital naturally flow. So, we call it win-win-win. It's write about it in the annual report all the time, and it has played out over time. And that's just a longer term thing, because the customers who win, the employees who win. Well, customers who win, they do business with you again, and they refer their friends and family. If employees win, and these days we have 20-some thousand people. This story was from a long time ago, but at the point we had about 5,000 people. Somebody made the observation about Markel that we have 5,000 people and 3,000 families.
Mm-hmm.
So there are a lot of families where there are more than one family member that work as part of the firm in some way or another. And I think that's a very good thing. And the last point I'll say about that, my wife, who ran one of our businesses. She recently retired as of the fall of last year. She's been retired almost a year now. But sometimes people would, and she ran our manufactured housing business. So again, a chemical engineer, the master's degree, worked at the DuPont company, but I sucked her in and got her to run a business for us that we needed some talent. And every once in a while, someone would make a comment about nepotism, and Susan would respond, "I think nepotism is for jobs that people actually want." So she was more than happy to hand her job to anybody who would step up and do it. It's pretty tough work. But that culture and that win-win-win structure is really how we compete over time.
The last panel, actually what I listened to a lot was the complexity of that business. And of course, it somehow seems it's a contrast to the simplicity of your business. You have a couple of pieces that fit together, that you know what you're doing in. So it seems to me that's a competitive advantage in terms of you don't have to be that smart and that complex.
Thank God. Yeah. And by the way, I think complexity and simplicity are in a circular wheel. And they are not opposite ends of a spectrum. Things that are complex sometimes bend in upon themselves and have some inherent simplicity within the structure. And things that you think of simple are more complex than you think. And there's a military acronym that was kind of popular 5 or 10 years ago. I don't hear it as buzzy as I did 5 or 10 years ago, but I say it all the time. It's called VUCA. Anybody heard that acronym talked about? VUCA. Volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And that describes the world. Right. It's a VUCA world. And we may live under the illusion that there were easier and simpler days. I'm not sure whether that is true or not. But relative to who we are now and the skills that we have and the ways in which things are changing through technological development, among others, and communication speeds, it's a VUCA world. So your skills at being able to handle volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, and not have that disrupt you internally or cause you to lose sleep at night, and always be able to say a little bit light on your feet and adaptive and not too dogmatic about your positions. That's an amazing and important skill in today's world.
I have to digress for a moment because back in May 21 at your annual meeting where we held our investor event there, Chris Davis was one of our speakers, and someone asked him that question, who were in the middle of COVID, like, what's the impact? How do you think about that? And that was basically his response was, he went back through the litany of things over the last 20, 25 years, and that there's always volatility, uncertainty. Those things recur all the time. Anyway, so an amplification of that. This year, you, of course, have changed the name of the company, and it's now Markel Group. And clearly that shows an evolution in the business over time. And kind of, what is that? How does it mean? What should we interpret it? How should people understand that?
I think you did a pretty good job of answering your own question. and it's really catching up to the reality of what has happened in Markel over the years. So if you go way back to the very beginning, and Markel started in 1930, there were periods of time when it operated as an underwriter and almost essentially purely as an underwriting operation. Mm-hmm. There were times, and this goes into the 50s and 60s, where it really became more of a broker. Mm-hmm. and operated as an agent rather than a principal, as an underwriter would. And then starting in the 70s, that came back into the underwriting focus, but it's been back and forth. And again, Sam Markel was the original founder of the business in 1930. And the original line of business that really powered the company for the first 20 or 30 years was insuring trucks as the interstate highway system grew. Mm-hmm. And at the time, I mean, today that's commodity is too strong a word, but that's a competitive business, and there's nothing special or magic about insurance trucks. In the early days, it was. Mm-hmm. So there were pretty good returns to being an expert and having specialized knowledge of the trucking business, because there wasn't actuarial data that would support what would happen. So Sam Markel being an entrepreneur and doing a lot of things, and there was a fleet of cars that Markel had that would be going out on the highways and checking on truckers and doing loss control and so on and so forth. Well, he bought a Ford dealership in Louisa County, Virginia. So in the corporate history of the Markel Group, there was a time when we owned a Ford dealership. So this is not new for us to sort of think about what's rational, what would make sense. Again, if we were a family, if this was a privately traded company among 10, 15, 20 family members that was just going to try to generate perpetual good returns on capital into perpetuity, what would you do? That's really the framing question that you could judge any idea that you look at to seem like it fits that or not. And that's pretty broad. So the name, the Markel Group, probably does a good job of capturing some of that history and legacy and mindset, and it reflects the reality of the way the business is diversified over the last 15, 18 years.
Right. Of course, a core part of the business is the insurance business, and that if underwritten properly and historically, that's what you've done, it creates that free float. But that takes a lot of execution and problems and issues. And how's that the business? What's the evolution? You said how it's changed over time. Where is it today? Especially in a world in which what's the interest rate going to be tomorrow? What's inflation going to be tomorrow? Those are all new issues, or not new. They're old. Right. They're just resurrected again.
Well, to the question about what is inflation going to be tomorrow, or interest rates going to be tomorrow, and let's say a month from now, 6 months from now, a year from now, probably somewhat different than they are now. And the whole point of the way Markel is run is no matter what the answer to that question is, we want to be doing okay. So we're not going to pride ourselves on being able to predict it. And we're not going to place bets that would cause either a really good thing to happen or a really bad thing to happen. Whatever the answer is, we wish to be resilient so that no matter what the answer is, we're there to answer the bell for the next round of the fight, number one. Number two, in insurance, the insurance business, like starting out, again, because the first and second generations of the Markel family had been so embedded in the insurance world for so long. When the third came around, and it was 3 of the 12 cousins in the fourth generation that really bought the company from the second generation and pitched forward. It was a pretty small company in Richmond, Virginia, and it was a regional company at best. In conjunction with the IPO that took place in 1986, which was really meant to fund a deal, a purchase of a company called Shan Morahan in Chicago, Illinois, that had a broader base of business throughout the country. I joke, we went from being a regional insurance company to a national insurance company. And the IPO, just to give you some sense of scale, was 500,000 shares at $8 a share. That was the total size of the IPO. And that wasn't the whole offering, but that was the secondary bit. And the market cap of the company would have been about $30 million at that point. Today it stands $18 billion. So it's been all right. Now, because we only had a little bit of money, the things that would be for sale were not exactly the crown jewels. So I call them sort of scratch and dent things that we bought. There were companies that had some issues, and part of what we were doing, it's like somebody who's a contractor who knows electrical contractor or sewage or plumbing, buying pieces of property that need work. And you do that work, you get your hands dirty, and you've created value, and you have a structure in a building that's worth a lot more than what it was. And the sweat equity kind of concept. So when we bought Shand and went from a regional company to a national company, that involved a lot of sweat equity from the people of Markel to make that business better. And it was for sale for a reason. So it was a lot of work. And also one of the things that's interesting about insurance for insurance nerds and investment analyst nerds, insurance accounting in and of itself has time lags. So if you do something, if you're a retailer and you have something you bought from a supplier for $100 and you sell it the next day for $200, that's a recognized sale. You got $100, you're putting it on the books that day. And insurance, if you sell a policy for $200 that lasts for a year and you expect to make $100, same profit margin as the retailer, it will be recognized ratably month by month over the 12-month period before it's fully visible to the outside shareholders. So there's inherent time lags in insurance accounting. And the net of all these things, the fact that we bought troubled stuff and we are conservative in our accounting as a matter of principle and way of doing things, means that we take a while, as long as possible, to recognize the income from things. So things can look like that's not really going so well. And we say, stay with us. And in fullness of time, it has indeed worked out well. So there's this J curve when we buy something in terms of reported earnings that an outside investor would see, that internally, we would think about faster than what the outside investor would see. So we went from being the local regional insurer to a national insurer. There was a J curve. Investors were skeptical and took a little while before it became evident that was indeed a good deal. And then about 10 years later, we bought Terra Nova in the UK, and we went from being a national insurer to an international insurer through the Lloyd's marketplace, the ability to do business all over. And again, same J curve, same kind of company with issues that took a little while to get through them, and same people being nervous and concerned about whether we'd blown it, that kind of stuff. So after we went from being a regional to a national to an international, some investor was sort of very nervously asking me, what are you guys going to do next? And the preferred answer for him would have been nothing. He didn't want the apple cart upset again. And I said, well, since we've gone from regional to national and national to international, unless we're going from international to intergalactic, I think you can rest. We're good. Now, as a practical matter, saying the word international, and in fact, even saying the word national, this is a big country. This is an immense market. This is a big world. And the amount of opportunities that exist and the growth that has taken place as we just kind of try to do the next thing and the next thing. And sometimes, people ask me, is Markel in this business? And I said, well, not yet. Not yet. We're a not yet company. And I don't like to use the word no. I prefer to use the not yet. And when somebody has a good idea in the construct of business, we're going to try to be creative and figure it out. And if it would make sense, if you and I were partners in this, and we didn't have to describe it to the outside world, but we were just partners in a commercial enterprise. Would we do it?
Mm-hmm.
And if the answer to that is yes, that doesn't mean that necessarily it's going to work, but we might give it a try.
Right. You do have three distinct parts of the business. The insurance business you have, therefore the information you get from that, the portfolio of investments you have in public companies, and then the private companies you do own. What's the cross-correlation and pollination of ideas, and therefore what comes to you potentially from that?
Well, they're fantastic. And Buffett, again, talking about Ben Graham, you really should talk about Buffett the same way,
Right.
because clearly the sort of the marquee student of somebody who took an education and some intellectual capital they got from Ben Graham and did well with that. So one of the things that Buffett says, being a businessman made him a better investor,
Mm-hmm.
and being an investor made him a better businessman. And your question is exactly why that is. So I get monthly financial reports that are real data of what's happening in a manufactured housing community business, in a building supply business, in a IT consulting business, in a medical business. I see those monthly financial reports every single month. I sit in some of those board meetings from time to time. I know the people who run them. We visit, we meet, we talk, we have a relationship. And as a consequence, that informs my thinking about every other decision that I make. And it has, I don't know how to quantify how helpful it has been, but I certainly am grateful and delighted for the opportunity to sit in those meetings and see those financial statements in about as real time as it gets, to be helpful in thinking about all the other things going on.
Mm-hmm. So when you one of the things I had the question asked recently was you have an investment portfolio, and of course interest rates have moved, and that has impact both on fixed income and equities. How that adjustment? How does that work? And what risks does that create for the company and earnings and?
Well, there's some pretty good news in the first derivative sense. The second derivative is where you start to get a little more complicated. The first derivative, it's not that complicated. We have $20 billion
Mm-hmm.
of fixed income holdings, and so every 100 basis points is worth $200 million to us. That's
Mm-hmm.
just straight math.
Right.
And you can see the investment income line reflecting the fact that every time for the last 12, 18 months that a bond has rolled off, the new bond that's being bought to hold that spot in the fixed income portfolio pays more.
Mm-hmm.
So now that's the first derivative, and it's just as simple as that. The second derivative is that there is feedback loop and interaction between insurance prices and interest rates, in the sense that, well, look, all other things being equal, that would mean insurance prices would be going down, because the net economic return when your float is worth more would diminish. There's time lags in that as well, and there's other things beyond just the one factor at work. But in general, it's a little bit easier to be profitable with interest rates being a little higher than lower.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Accounting differences and whatever else. So one of the things, of course, international accounting has done is they've decided IFRS, whatever, they're discounting reserves. What do you think about that, and what would you think about the implications for bringing that to the United States?
Well, I started out life as an accountant, I was a CPA.
I think yours got turned off somehow. It got tired. It's been a long day, even for the microphones,
What a great metaphor for accounting. You have to change. It was working fine. What was wrong with it? But now we're going to just swap it out. So I started out life as an accountant, and I lasted 18 months at PricewaterhouseCoopers. I was not on the partner track. And as an accountant, I would say I'm more interested in dollars than numbers. Now, the thing is about the accounting training, and I do think it's a good undergraduate thing to study and be competent in, but let's not get carried away with it.
Mm-hmm.
Because think if you're going to move to Germany and you were going to try to build a life and build a career and do things in Germany, what's the very first thing you should do? I think it's learn German. It's the language. You're not going to be able to operate in the society if you are not a speaker of the tongue that everybody's using. So accounting is the language of business. And you need to have a fundamental understanding of accounting in order to understand the underlying narrative and the economics of what's really taking place. That said, and again, this is why I said yes when you asked me to come speak, and the idea of paying homage to Ben Graham, there's an ongoing role for analysis and analysts, because it's a big mistake to take things only at the surface level. You got to dig deep beneath that and say, what does this really mean? What does this really mean? So in terms of economic reality, whether you use GAAP or IFRS, there's no difference in economic reality. Abraham Lincoln used to say, how many legs does a dog have if you call a tail a leg? He says 4. Calling a tail a leg does not make it a leg. So to some degree, the notion of those sorts of differences are absolutely irrelevant. Now that said, statements that are made and communicated, whether through GAAP or IFRS, create some noise, and I think they create some confusion. And I think the accounting profession, in so many ways, has lost its way to really be good navigators in the cockpit to tell the pilot where they are and how fast they're going and what the map is showing. So there are some real challenges, and I spend a lot of time, for any readers of the Markel Annual Report, I write about accounting a lot, and all my colleagues groan, and the obligatory accounting essay of this year. I'm sorry, we can't communicate accurately without talking about this a little bit. So on that hand, really, Mike went out again. I don't think it really matters. I guess PCOV or something got to my mic. Anyway, silence. We can hear you. We'll give it another while. So the only thing that would be certainly true if we went from GAAP to IFRS, where there's a fair amount of valuation stuff and valuation experts that would opine about the different parts of the balance sheet and go through the discounting of the loss reserves, that would cause us to spend money on something that really didn't add value to the business. And I hate doing that.
One of the aspects, I guess we don't have time today, line's going down. One of the aspects of the investment portfolio, the float you create, is of course the allocation between fixed income and equity. And one of the things, of course, that makes Berkshire so well positioned, given his ability to put so much into the equity component. And of course, that's a limitation of how much capital you do have, the business you write. What's the evolution of Markel, and what would you think that looks like? What's the opportunities?
Well, the evolution of Markel is such that when we were a tiny company, again, 500,000 shares at $8 and trying to gain credibility in the insurance world. And credibility is a very important component of why somebody's willing to buy insurance from you, because you're going to pay them later. Wait. Show me the money. So showing them the money basically meant having a fixed income portfolio that was set aside, in essence, for the benefit of the policyholders over time. So we grew fast. And while we were growing fast, the rate of the growth in the book value, the shareholders' equity, the capital, was roughly the same. But then there comes a point in time, and this happened in the 1990s, when it was a quote-unquote soft insurance market. It's like the conversations about the credit market and the cycle there, where it was tough to get adequate prices. So really, if you look at the decade of the 1990s, our insurance premiums were basically flat at the top line. But yet, the shareholders' capital, the equity value of the company, went up by 4x during that, because we invested reasonably well during that period of time. And we bought more and more equities during that period of time, because the rate of growth in the shareholders' equity line was at a steeper ascent than the rate of growth of the insurance line. So that gave us flexibility to change the investment allocation. What we've been going through over the last 3, 4, 5 years is that insurance has been at a very accelerated growth clip. And at the same time, you had the wildfires, natural catastrophes at extraordinary levels, maybe new, systemically normal, maybe the base rate has changed. But anyway, that pinched insurance results. We had our own internal challenges with some of the deals we've done and working our way out of things. So that caused our fixed income allocation to go back up and be pretty heavy and sort of constrain a bit of what we would do on the equity side. You can argue, debate, I don't know whether it's this quarter, next year, 2 years after that, I would suspect that the red hot conditions we've seen in the insurance market would start to level out again. It's a market, it's cyclical. And if that happens, I mean, it will happen. We just don't know the time. That in and of itself will cause probably the rate of growth of the equity capital line of the company to increase again, at which point, we could start to sweeten up that mix of more equity shares and have more range of motion and freedom to do so. Number one. Number two, again, getting back to the baking cast iron skillet analogy, if we were smart and we wanted to pretend we were smart, and we said 2 years ago, I don't know about this market, and hey, let's just keep some real short duration fixed income and cash around, that would not have been a bad decision. Mm-hmm. So we've sort of back-ended into a reasonably good decision by virtue of the capital we have. Also, what you've seen at Markel for the last couple of years is we've started repurchasing shares at a much faster rate than we ever have in the past. So when we were a tiny company, the idea of just building up the capital, getting to critical mass, that was very important. Now that we are of reasonable size, the toggle switch of repurchasing our own shares is more of a realistic option for us than what it would have been 10 or 20 years ago, and we're using it.
Right. Of course, the larger portion of the investment portfolio is the fixed income piece. It does seem that's a latent earnings growth for the company, given where rates have gone. So the largest part of your portfolio is clearly higher yielding, higher return today.
Exactly, and that's
as
that
well
math
as
of
moving more equity too.
100 basis points is $200 million bucks.
Right. Right. If anybody has questions at any point, there's two questions over here.
We'll hope to get you a working microphone unless it's a really hard question.
Unless it's an accounting question, then it won't work.
Hi, thanks. In terms of going back into 2020 when COVID hit, in terms of I believe that you weren't adding equities, you were selling some, and Berkshire was also not really adding. So, which I think was wise because you didn't know, it was hard to know what direction things were going. So I don't think not doing 2020, quarterbacking. I guess what I'm curious about is how do you think about like the right tail risks in terms of the capital, which is typically treated as permanent capital, but with rising, climate issues and other right tail risks that may be a little bit more higher probability, I guess. How do you think about that when you're thinking about the runway for the investment portfolio?
It's a composite question. I appreciate the non second guessing or hindsight 2020 aspect of the way you asked it. So I appreciate that. And your point about uncertainty, just not knowing, and it is a marker of the inherent conservatism of Markel, and the sense that we wish to have a business that lasts for generations. That we're going to try to take tail risks, whether it's right tail risk or left tail risk, off the table as much as is humanly possible, and not be out there dancing on the edges. Ajit Jain is the dean of understanding what climate change and prop cat losses might be, and please don't quote me on these numbers, but they're directionally correct. He would have, I think, at the recent meeting in Berkshire, talked about the capital that they're putting out in the Fed to handle property cat risk these days. And if you thought that the base load of what a normal year of property cat losses used to be, call it 100 just to get a base load, he says it's 200. No, it's 200. So you can run the models and do that work and say, look, if you're being paid appropriately in a probabilistic way on a base rate of 200 out there, that's probably a pretty good risk to take. And we would be doing that. That does not mean that next quarter will show great results, but if those base rates are reasonable, and we're constantly iterating both the terms and definitions of the policy, the pricing of the policy, the geographical areas where we write them towards what we think is better than what it used to be, based on the data we have today that we didn't have yesterday, we get there. And I think that's true not just for Markel, it's true for Berkshire, it's true for the industry. And some people are better or worse and quicker or slower to get there, but you have to get there because you can't not get there. If the insurance business does not produce underwriting profitability, it can't pay the claims. So we, along with the other insurance companies, will get there.
Hi. Can you just talk about what's your self-discipline
Thank you.
What is my self-discipline or cell discipline?
Sell.
So, well, I tell the story about my grandmother. And if some of you know me, you might have heard this before. But my grandfather died in 1966. And he was a small town businessman. And in those days, small town business people oftentimes, had individual portfolios of stocks. And they would go to the diner and drink coffee and talk about them and whatnot. And my grandfather was one of those kind of people. And he had 12 or 13 stocks, nice middle class sort of small town businessman. Well, my grandmother was the kind of person who basically, after he died, she never made another substantive decision for the rest of her life, for 30 years. Lived in the same house. His suits hung in the closet. His shoes were on the floor. And those 12 or 13 stocks that my grandmother inherited from my grandfather, she kept those. Now, as a kid nerd interested in the stock market, I will tell you on a Friday night when I could not get a date, on more than one occasion, I would sit with my grandmother and we would watch Wall Street Week with Louis Rukeyser and talk about things. And my grandmother was not an unsophisticated woman. She graduated from Swarthmore College in the 1920s, just kind of ahead of its time, was a teacher for many years, a professional career woman. The very first paycheck she ever got, she used to buy a fur coat. She got a motorcycle burn by being on the back of somebody's motorcycle in her 80s. So this is a fascinating woman, but she didn't sell anything. Now, fortunately, and I was 4 when my grandfather died, so I didn't really know him or have any memory of it. But somehow or another, among those 12 or 13 stocks he owned, one of them was Lockheed Martin, and another one was Pepsi Cola. Well, guess what? The other 10 stocks in the portfolio could have gone to 0, and it didn't matter. The math of your winners compounding over time, and earlier there was a discussion about short selling and sort of the upside down math of getting something wrong. I mean, imagine being short Lockheed Martin or Pepsi. That would be a really bad thing. It would wipe you out. Well, the good news is being long is the exact opposite of that. It kept my grandmother in a pleasant middle-class lifestyle for the rest of her life. So it's not that I never sell anything, but I am really slow to sell, sometimes to the frustration of my colleagues or some of our shareholders. But the mistakes you make mathematically diminish over time, whereas the things you got right compound over time. So to your point about not having to be the smart guy to make this work, there's another example where by not being too antsy and saying you make more money with your butt than your brains. That's true. Now you have to have enduring, patient capital in order to see that play out. But again, that gets back to the structural advantage of what we have. We do have an enduring, permanent capital base that can let things play out. And fortunately, it's a true story. When I joined Markel in 1990, the very first stock I bought was Berkshire Hathaway. Guess what? We still own that. And guess what? I was stupid in that I didn't buy more. And I went back as sort of a diagnosis exercise. And this is, again, where humility and stupidity and never get too cocky about stuff. I mean, I found out about Berkshire in 1984 when I read the Carol Loomis article. Mm-hmm. And I was so stupid, I didn't buy it because I thought it was too expensive. Mm-hmm. And I sat there and sucked my thumb and watched it until 1990, 6 years before buying some. And then to compound that stupidity, I didn't buy it again until 1998. And somebody mentioned Boston chicken in the conversation earlier today and the shorting of Boston chicken. Well, here you go. Here's someone who shorted Boston chicken, personally, PA, not the company account, and learned something very, very painful about shorting through that process. And in that process, and again, in the late 90s, I had the worst underperformance professionally that I've ever had. And I didn't know I was going to make a living. I got brochures from dental schools. And I'm not kidding you about that, because I thought I was a dinosaur and just didn't understand the markets. But fortunately, one of the things I did in that lack of understanding is like, man, these numbers of Berkshire are still working. Mm-hmm. So 14 years after being exposed to it the first time, I'm still buying it. And I mean, I don't know the most recent time I've bought Berkshire, but it's within the last couple of quarters. I continue to add to it. So sell discipline
in your seats, and I understand the business that so many of you are in, is critical. And I get that. And it's tough, but that's the intellectual curiosity of Ben Graham. There is valuable self-discipline and things to be done based on what you're doing. But I'm not the guy to give you any wisdom or guidance about that, because fortunately, it is one, it's not that it's not important at all. And we do sell some things, and there's things that should be sold, and we make ourselves do it and think about that all the time. But it is one of the least important factors of whether you will look at Markel over long periods of time and say whether we were successful or not.
Jay, you have a question?
Yeah, sure. I heard VJ Dowling once talk about sort of the best benchmark of how an insurance company grows its value over time is looking at just book value per share plus dividends per share, and that compounding and growth over time. I'm curious, is there a number at Markel of over 10 or 20 years, how well the company has grown, book value plus dividends per share
Right.
over time?
There is, and I know VJ, and he does great work. And I read his stuff, actually. And when you see those charts and when he talks about it, he says excluding Berkshire Hathaway. Well, why? VJ's a smart guy. Why would he do that? It's because Berkshire is not just its insurance business. It is a lot of other things too. And that also describes Markel. There are a lot of other things too that are not well captured by the GAAP accounting of book value. So what I do when I'm looking at, should we be buying in stock? I mean, I do actually write some numbers down and make a calculation of what I think it's worth. I look at our insurance business and I think about that and the float and the investments per share and what those pencil out to, and I subtract out the debt. And then I also look at our Markel Ventures businesses, which are cash flow businesses, and I assign a multiple of the cash flow, which really has very, very little to do with the book value. And it's just sort of sum of the parts it and think about that. And I write about this in the annual report every single year. And what I also do is I put it in 5-year buckets. So as opposed to just the year-by-year reporting, I give you 5-year buckets, which is what our incentive compensation is based upon, to the earlier comments in the panel about what are the decision rights, what are the incentives, things like that. Well, my incentive starts with 5 years of performance, not one. And if you look over those 5-year buckets, and we started doing that, we put 21 years of data year by year at the bottom of the annual report every year in this shareholders letter. And the 5-year buckets, I think I started doing that 3 or 4 years ago. So you can look at those and you can see rough that, every 5 to 7 years, it seems like it's double what it used to be. And rough, rule of 72 math, 5 to 7 years, what's that mean? It's 10 to 15%. And that's been going on in rough justice terms since the IPO in '86.
Somebody took the mic from me. I know you're buying back stock.
And you've bought stock personally. I follow insider buying regularly, and I've noticed you've bought stock recently, I think, in the open market. And I suspect those are free will. You just think the stock's cheap, so you're buying stock?
Actions speak louder than words, yes.
Mm-hmm. Great answer.
Hi, Tom. This is Amit Pandey. It's good to see you, and it was good seeing you in Omaha during Markel brunch. So my question is related to a comment that Charlie Munger made during this Berkshire Hathaway meeting, that value investment has become slightly challenging over time. Then Warren was more optimistic. He said, if we have to do it all over again, we'll get the opportunities. So I want to hear your thoughts on that. How is the value investment landscape has changed? And part of that question is for a younger person who is starting now or a few years in the business, which is the pond that has more fishes, where more undervalued opportunities are?
Well, in terms of the value investment statement and Munger's comments, and give me some grace to answer this in something of a long way, but get to a point. So again, after I bought that stock in 1990 of Berkshire, I went to my first Berkshire meeting in 1991, and I remember it vividly. It was in the Orpheum Theater. There were only about 700 people there. I finally swallow hard and buy a share of Berkshire Hathaway. And the meeting starts, and there's Buffett and Munger, and they welcome everybody. They thank everybody for coming. And then Buffett says, and by the way, thanks for coming. I appreciate it. But gosh, we have done so well for so long. There's just no way we can continue to compound at these kind of rates. And I go, I just got here. Literally. So they've been saying that for a long time. And they have valid reasons to why they would say that. But I'm not and by the way, that started off a little, Buffett, you can't just call him and you can't send him an email. But there was for a long time, you could write him a letter. And part of his time management thing would be that he would take your letter and maybe he would respond at the bottom of it and send your letter back to you. So after that meeting, I actually did write him a letter and I said, "Dear Mr. Buffett, my name is Tom Gayner. Just attended my first Berkshire meeting, and you made this comment that the size and scale of Berkshire is now an anchor, lowering your future returns. Let me ask you this. If you look at ExxonMobil or its predecessors, that's been both one of the largest and most profitable companies in the country for over 100 years. Is there anything about the example of ExxonMobil that is applicable to Berkshire Hathaway?" Send it off. 2 weeks later, this envelope comes. It's Keywood Plaza, Omaha, Nebraska. And my fingers are shaking a little bit, and I open it up. And sure enough, there's my letter. And at the bottom of the letter, I have this little note. It says, "Dear Tom, that's a fascinating question. Please come again to next year's annual meeting and ask me, and we'll talk about it." WEB. And being the sort of person who just can't resist things like I am, I took that. I photocopied it because I wasn't going to let go of the original. I still have the original. And I took the photocopy, and at the bottom of that, I wrote, "Dear Warren, I'll be there, TSG." Now, that was the end of our little pen pal relationship. But that did indeed happen. And you know what? Berkshire has compounded at great rates through the disciplines and the principles of value investing, both in investing and in rational behavior and rational decision models for a long time. And again, getting back to Ben Graham, one of his disciplines that is so important and so understudied and underappreciated is the classics. I gave a talk at UVA recently to an investment club thing that I'm trying to start. It was got written up in the Wall Street Journal in Jason Zweig's column. If anybody wants to get in on it, let me know. The more the merrier. And I was talking about, riffing along, and I was talking about the goose that laid the golden egg. And I had 50 or 60 students in there, and I could see I lost the room. There were blank eyes. I said, wait, stop. How many of you, show hands, know what I'm talking about when I say the goose that laid the golden egg? And of the 60 students in there, only 8 of them raised their hands. I said, time out. I am not going forward. You need to tell me this is not just some casual polling question. How many people have heard of the goose that laid the golden egg? And the hand count went from maybe 8 to 10. The goose that laid the golden egg. The story of deferred gratification, of cash flow, of valuing the discounted streams of cash flow to today from what's happening. Not killing the goose. I mean, are you going to be an investor and not know in your bones the story of the goose that laid the golden eggs? Well, that's Aesop's Fables. It's 2,000 years old. That's the classics. That's the narrative that's part of what Ben Graham was built upon. And that was what he was built upon. And only after that did he do the math to turn it into financial analysis and security analysis. So to think you can do math without understanding of the fundamentals, good luck to you. But I don't know how to do that. And I think it'd be a whole lot easier if you do indeed embed the classics. So here I'm getting to the answer to your question. Those stories, those fables, those myths and legends, the Greek and Roman mythology, what's it really about? It's about human nature. Why do people, the most fascinating thing in the world, people, why do people do what people do? Why do smart people do dumb things? Those answers are in books that are 2,000 years old. And they come from a lot of different cultures and a lot of different traditions, but the fundamental themes in all of them are remarkably similar, no matter which culture they come from. And so the idea of being a value investor in my mind is that you know that, and you can see the flaws writ large. You can see the flaws, most importantly, in yourself. You can have study and humility and dedication that all combine to yield a pretty good result. And that's a bull market. That's a permanent bull market to be good at that.
Sounds to me like it came down at the same time that Warren did, and that the opportunity set will be there because people are there, and people make for opportunities. So,
Right.
Is there one last question, or we're kind of at the end of our day? You had a question over there?
Yes, I'd love you to opine upon the value of managing both sides of the balance sheet, opposed to outsourcing maybe the left side.
Oftentimes, left side being the asset side of the balance sheet. Many insurance companies do that. I think for cultural reasons, Berkshire and Markel have kept that in-house. And I think and I talked to our underwriters, I talked to our insurance people, and I said, look, underwriting and investing are two sides of the exact same coin. It's probabilistic thinking. And if you're doing both of them, and going back and forth a little bit between the two, I think that makes you better at each one. And an investor who kind of keeps his toe in the realm of how underwriters think and act, and vice versa, makes each of them a better underwriter and a better investor. So I think that's culturally important to keep them connected in-house. Sometimes.
We're out of time.
Yep.
So.
Thank you.
All right, I've been waiting for this the entire day. So thank you, Tom, and thank you, Bob, for your great insights into financial markets, and especially thank you, Tom, for showing us how to write a love letter to a billionaire. Okay, so I was separating everyone from refreshment hour. The good news is you're almost there. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Yifu Lee, and I'm a long-term volunteer with the CFA New York Society. It feels great to be back here live after hosting this conference 3 years in a row, virtually. I'm sure we all miss the simple human interactions and networking. I'm very lucky to be in this position as we have had so many great speakers today. I'm sure the audience have learned a lot from all of you through our thought-provoking keynotes, panels, and Q&A. We would like to thank our presenters, moderators, organizers, and the supporting CFA and forum staff. Please kindly join me in giving them a round of applause for sharing their passion, knowledge, and time commitment with us today. Thank you for that. We are extremely grateful to our lead sponsor, Fordham University Gabelli School of Business, supporting us through the years and generously letting us host our event here at the school again. A big shout out to our warrior, Professor Jim Kelly, who's always here to support us, rain or shine, and even shortly after surgery. We'd also like to thank our other sponsors, including Schaefer Cohen Capital Management, Robotic Value Investors, Brandy's Investment Partners, Ivy Business School, Ben Graham Center for Value Investing, and ETF Global. 2 quick housekeeping matters. We will be hosting our virtual portion of our presentation tomorrow. Main topics include ESG and Globalization 2.0. There's still time to register, so it's not too late to join us. Finally, I'm pleased to be the second person after Mr. Andrew Oslander to invite you to the CFA New York Society's annual celebration. It will take place on October 26th at a Sun Lounge on Columbus Circle. With that, I'd like to close out our live day one portion of our 10th annual CFA Ben Graham Conference. We hope for those that are here with us in person to join us for our reception across the hall. We thank you all for attending and looking forward to collaborate with you again.